And yeah, welcome everybody to this second FCI webinar of the year on machine learning and AI, a sort of collaborative session between the FCI Early Careers and AI special interest groups, which is quite exciting. We've got Dr. Kieran Zucker presenting, who's one of the co-founders of the group. We've got Professor Jeremy Wyatt, the chair of the AI SIG, chairing the session. So hopefully you can see the housekeeping. Please could you keep yourself muted until the Q&A at the end. There's some instructions there on keeping yourselves muted and some keyboard shortcuts. And we'll have a Q&A section at the end of the webinar. So if you could type any questions into the chat box during the presentation, then we can get to them at the end. This session is being recorded as well, so it'll be put up onto the faculty website and YouTube channel afterwards to watch back. So yeah, without further ado, Jeremy, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Joe, and welcome everybody this evening. Thanks for taking time out of your family time to participate in this. We're very grateful indeed to Kieran Zucker, who offered this topic as a webinar to the AI SIG and Early Careers SIG. And it's an excellent general introductory talk about machine learning. Kieran is actually quite an expert in this area. He's a specialist, as well as being a clinician, specialist in clinical oncology, specialist registrar in clinical oncology, and also clinical research fellow based in Leeds, working in the Leeds Institute of Data Analytics that I was part of before I moved down south. He has done quite a bit of work around cancer prediction, risk prediction, interpretation of MRI scans in cardiology, automated COVID detection analytics, and detection of cancer recurrence events. So I think we're going to hear a lot about these various applications, as well as about the principles of machine learning development and validation of AI algorithms. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk, Kieran. And I think you'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then there's an opportunity for discussion, starting off with questions that should have been recorded in the chat. But then if we run out of those, we may have to find some questions ourselves. So go ahead, Kieran.
Right, so let me just get my slides up. So hopefully, we're already running into technical difficulties, always a good, bear with me one moment.
You usually find it easier to get into PowerPoint before you get into display.
Yeah, which I did have that up, but it wasn't playing ball. Let's try again.
It was working perfectly 2 minutes.
I know, we did a dry run just a minute ago and it was working fine. Right, I think that's it, hopefully.
Great.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, have we got the slides up now?
Yep.
So first of all, welcome to everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity for speaking to you, and it's really lovely to see so many people here in the evening. I wanted to give a talk that gives a basic introduction to AI and machine learning and how it relates to health, because increasingly we are all being bombarded with information about AI, both in healthcare and outside of healthcare. And in fact, actually getting good quality information to be able to understand what this all means and what we're talking about can be quite difficult. And so I started out from the principle of there are some key questions that I think are kind of important for everyone to have a basic grasp of, which is essentially what is artificial intelligence and what is machine learning? What can it do and what's it capable of? How can it be used and is it being used in healthcare? But also importantly, what it can't do and how we can tell if something that's put in front of us is any good. And my hope is that by the time we get to the end of this talk, those of you who don't necessarily have much expertise or experience with any AI or machine learning will be better placed to answer some of these questions. The first thing is, what is artificial intelligence and machine learning? And I'm going to start out by playing a video that might seem slightly unrelated, but hopefully you will see why it is that I'm playing it in just a moment. So the reason why I've played this clip is because it seems almost bizarre now to look back to media in the 90s and see people struggle to describe what the internet is. But those same people who quite clearly have very little understanding of what the technology is are still there on the TV giving highly opinionated information to the general public. And the reality of it is that we're not in a dissimilar situation now when it comes to artificial intelligence and machine learning. We get a lot of coverage in the media, but a lot of the people who are writing these articles are in a similar boat to these people in the 90s, and as much as they don't really understand what it is that they're writing about, but that's still the information that people are being given access to. And so I did a quick search just for some articles about AI and machine learning from the last few weeks on Google. And here's just a few snippets of things that picked up. The Innovation Origins is an online media outlet that specializes in giving information about startups and technology. And this is an article about the fact that it's currently impossible to program an algorithm that can detect whether or not a super intelligent AI might harm the world. So the quality of what's being put out is slightly sensationalized. And the question is, does this person know what they're talking about? Well, you might say that this is a fairly fringe publication. So let's go with something from traditional print media. The Herald Scotland, this is just from a couple of days ago. Why artificial intelligence will either be the savior or exterminator of the human race. And you might say, well, maybe this is because it's not really got a scientific focus. But then we have the article in Scientific American from last month talking about the fact that if artificial intelligence doesn't get enough rest, it's going to start to hallucinate just like humans do. And the problem is when you've got these sorts of super sensationalist articles that don't necessarily have a very good grounding in the facts, they are at best misleading and at worst completely wrong. And so when people try and find out more about artificial intelligence, it's very difficult to actually see through a lot of the nonsense that's out there and get good quality information. Now, they actually looked in a study in 2018 for a 6-month period at all publications that were related to artificial intelligence. And when they looked at this, they found that the vast majority were focused solely on industry announcements. A third of them used sources that were only from industry without looking at any other external sources at all, and so showed an enormous bias towards the industry narrative. Elon Musk, who's been very outspoken on a number of levels to do with AI, was referenced in 12% of articles, and that the media coverage of AI was incredibly politically correlated, such that media outlets that were traditionally thought of as more right-wing were focusing on AI in terms of geopolitics and finance, and those that were more left-leaning news outlets were leaning more on topics such as ethics and safety and things of that nature. And the difficulty is that when you've got people who don't know what they're talking about, potentially producing stuff that's misleading, where there's a very heavy industry bias and where there's kind of political agendas mixed into this, it becomes very difficult for the general public or people like you and I to read articles and actually work out what's going on. And you might think that actually the situation would be much better within academia. The problem is people don't agree on what they mean by artificial intelligence. And so the formal definition that you get from the Oxford English Dictionary is the theory and development of computer systems able to perform tasks normally require human intelligence. And then they give a number of examples. And to me, I would say my informal definition is really about getting computers to complete tasks near, at, or above human levels of achievement. And to my mind, that includes a whole load of different approaches. Machine learning gets probably the most headlines, and that's because there's been a lot of success in the area over the last few years. But there's a whole load of other methods that could be applied, such as evolutionary computing, Bayesian logic, and these various other methods. But the academic community often applies artificial intelligence as a label for things that I wouldn't necessarily view as artificial intelligence. So to use an example, this is some information that came out with the Artificial Intelligence in Health and Care Award from NHSX. This was from the first round, and they produced their definition of AI for their funding. And they've said it includes models based on statistical analysis and expert systems that rely on if-then statements. Now, to me, personally, models based on statistical analysis is just a very, very general definition, such that a regression analysis would fall under what they're saying is artificial intelligence. To me, standard statistics as they have been around isn't really artificial intelligence, but to other people, to other academics, they might disagree. expert systems that rely on if-then statements. So if this happens, then do this. Well, that could include clicking on a graphical user interface and something open up. If you click on this, then something opens. That's an if-then statement. Now, in some circumstances, that might be artificial intelligence, but in the example I've just given, I wouldn't say it is. And so the problem is that when people badge something as artificial intelligence, you really have to dig underneath the surface to tell what it is that they mean. And is it the same as what you expect? And a lot of the time, people will use this as a phrase because it's exciting. People are interested in it. And what you might find is that what they've actually implemented isn't what you were expecting at all. So what's machine learning then? Well, machine learning is a particular approach to trying to develop artificial intelligence. And they're a group of methods that aim to get computers to complete a task, but without having to specify exactly how the computer does it. So it is a subset of artificial intelligence, and within machine learning, a subgroup of that is deep learning, which is a particular type of approach to machine learning. But the important thing here is that although we're going to focus predominantly on machine learning in this talk, this is certainly by no means the only approach that you can take to trying to develop artificial intelligence. And although it gets the majority of the airtime, that doesn't mean that it's the only thing that shows promise. So I suppose the next question that we come to is, how does machine learning work? And if we boil it down into its most simple form, what we start with is we start with a collection of data and information, and we have a task that we want to complete. And in this case, we've labeled it a prediction, but it doesn't have to be a prediction. And the idea is that you have a framework, a method that chomps up and looks at patterns in the input data and tries to relate those to the task that you are specifying. So how does this work? Well, what you're looking for is you're getting a method that looks for patterns in data. It then looks for lots of patterns. And it then uses the patterns of patterns to build up a picture for the task that you're setting it. So you take the patterns and patterns of patterns that you find within your original data set and try and use those to complete the task that you have at the end. And the important thing here is that what you are actually generating is you are generating a complex statistical representation of your original data set and the information that you are using and how that relates to the task that you are trying to complete. So that can feel a little bit removed and difficult to wrap your head around. So in order to try and demonstrate this, I've got a video that's a few years old now. This is for some work that was done by Google DeepMind. And the idea here was that they developed an algorithm that was learning to play Atari games. And so this is a paddleball game, and all that they are using as the input information is what is shown on the screen. And the task is to try and get the highest possible score. And so they set the algorithm up. They haven't told it anything about how the game is played. They just give it the input information of what's on the screen, and they're trying to get the highest score. So after 10 minutes of exposure to the game, it hasn't really been able to pick up how the controls interact with the paddle, how the paddle needs to interact with the ball, and it doesn't perform very well. I mean, this is probably what I would imagine a preschooler or a toddler trying to play the game would be like. It's not doing very well. However, if you give it more information, so you give it a longer exposure to the data, so it's 120 minutes playing the game, it's now understood how the controls relate to the paddle, how the paddle needs to relate to the ball, how the ball needs to relate to the bricks, and how the bricks relate to the score. And it's now playing very well. This is, I would imagine, a bit like an expert human player. It's doing very well. It's not losing. It's getting a good score. But then what can happen is if you give it even longer, it doesn't just perform very well. It tries to find the most effective technique in order to get that highest score. So instead of just being excellent, this time around, it works. It's identified that if it essentially bores a hole down one side, then it can more efficiently get the highest score. And so now it's not just a case of performing well, but it's trying to optimize to get that score quickly. And so this is a really good example of where the framework for the algorithm is set up, but where no extra information is provided other than that original what's on the screen. And so the algorithm is working out how it gets the job done. It is not programmed to do so. And that is the essence of machine learning. But one of the things that commonly comes up is people talk about machine learning like it's a human brain. And this is not surprising that people do this because of terms like neural networks and some of the phrasing that is used around machine learning. And ultimately, there is a tendency for people to start talking about machine learning in a human-like way. And the important thing to remember is that machine learning is a numerical representation of information. It is absolutely nothing like a human brain. So when you see information in articles talking about machine learning needing sleep, you have to think to yourself that this doesn't sound like it's very plausible, because why on earth would a statistical representation of information require sleep? Now, it may well be that that article was trying to use an analogy for something, but the problem is that the headline information is very misleading. And the terminology that is around AI can also be very unhelpful. We use phrases like training, teaching, learning, and these make it feel as though it's got this human component to it. But despite the terminology, machine learning is in no way like a person. It doesn't think like a human being. It doesn't function like a human brain. And so this kind of anthropomorphic terminology can sometimes be incredibly misleading and make us think about AI and particularly machine learning in a way that can be incredibly unhelpful. So what can't machine learning do? Well, it might sound strange that I'm starting out with what it can't do, but I think that if you can wrap your head around some of these limitations, it becomes a lot easier to start thinking about where machine learning might fall down and how you might start to work out whether or not what you're being sold is snake oil or whether or not there's actually something legitimate going on. So the first thing it can't do is it can't find patterns that are not there. Now, this may sound trivially obvious, but this can hide itself in a number of ways. So in order for the machine learning approach to work, there has to be enough information in the data that you're using to develop your algorithm that relates to the task that you are setting it. So what do I mean by this? Let's say, for argument's sake, I want to build an algorithm, and the algorithm's purpose is to look at the current patients in my hospital who have a cancer diagnosis and what the likelihood is that they're going to be admitted to hospital within the next 7 days. That will help me do things like resource planning, potentially do early intervention for people who might be at risk of needing admission. And so that might be a really helpful tool. Now, if I have data and information on those patients that includes things like their previous health conditions and health diagnoses, recent blood tests, whether or not they've had recent oncological treatment, maybe some publicly available information about things like weather and so on and so forth, there's likely to be enough information in that that relates to someone's probability of needing an admission. That means that that algorithm is likely to have some chance of being able to work. If, however, all I'm starting with is one set of bloods per patient, the likelihood that that's going to do a decent job falls substantially. And if we take something that doesn't in any way relate to the task, like horoscopes, then it's not going to work at all. But what you will often see and often hear is people falling into the trap of taking a data set, trying simple statistical approaches, saying, oh, it's not working. I know what we'll do, we'll try a machine learning approach. And what you need to do is you need to take a step back and say, is the reason this isn't working because there is some kind of underlying limitation of the thing I have tried? Or is it to do with the fact that there's an underlying limitation of the data that I've got? And if somebody is saying that they have an algorithm that uses a data set to perform a task, and you can't see any plausible way that that information in the data set could relate to the task it's trying to complete, I think that your kind of level of skepticism should instantly jump. The algorithms can also only do tasks it's been trained specifically to do. So if we take that example again of the oncology admission prediction, and let's say we build the algorithm, it works really well, and I get approached by somebody in a hospital who says, now we'd like to try and do this in cardiology. The temptation is to say, well, I've got an algorithm that works really well, let's just deploy it in the cardiology department and that'll do. But the problem is the things that make a cardiology patient more or less likely to be brought into hospital may well vary quite substantially from people who are known to have a cancer diagnosis. And so there is no guarantee that when we use it for this alternative task, which albeit similar is different, that it will function in the same way and with the same degree of accuracy. And therefore it needs to be tested, it needs to be checked, and it may need some adaptation using cardiology data in order to get it working in that cardiology population. And this doesn't only apply when you move between different tasks, but also when you move between different settings. So it may well be that the way that people capture information or store information is different in different centers, such that an algorithm that works really well in one center doesn't necessarily automatically port across to other places and perform in exactly the same way. And so we need to be mindful that when we're trying to do a different task, that it's checked to see if it works and tweaked if necessary. But I think the other thing is that if someone is coming to you and proposing a tool where they're saying it's a one-size-fits-all and it can do a whole host of different things, again, I would be incredibly skeptical about that, because as it stands at the moment, artificial general intelligence, something that is an algorithm that can just do everything, doesn't really exist. And although you can optimize an algorithm towards multiple endpoints, often they don't perform as well in any of those than individual ones that are trained fit. So the next thing is it can't identify things it's not seen before. And what I mean by this is that because your algorithm is a representation of the information it has been exposed to before, if there is something that is missing from that original data set, then the algorithm has no opportunity to identify the pattern. So if, for example, you have a rare presentation that either is not seen very often and therefore isn't found within the data set enough to be easily identifiable as a pattern, or is simply absent, then when you try and use that algorithm in the real world, it has no chance of being able to identify this more unusual presentation. And this is important because a lot of the time people will use one data set for both building and testing the functioning of an algorithm. And if that entire data set misses something, which might be rare but still important, it may look like it's functioning very well, but might still miss something that's incredibly important clinically and therefore needs to be borne in mind in terms of how that algorithm is then used. And I'm going to talk about an example of that later on. Related to this is that there is no ability to differentiate between bias and true patterns. A pattern that occurs because of bias or discriminatory behavior is a pattern nonetheless. And machine learning has no ability to apply moralistic views or be able to sort out what is something that is undesirable. It will simply identify a pattern that is there. And this has been found out to the cost of many applications within the financial sector, where historically people from certain ethnic minority groups might have been discriminated against in terms of lending patterns. And so when people have attempted to build machine learning algorithms, people have identified that there may actually be ethnic bias in the way that the algorithm functions because it has inherited that bias from the data. It's identified a pattern and it continues to implement that pattern going forward. And so within healthcare, this is potentially very dangerous. It means that things that we currently do now that may have a negative impact on people's health outcome can be perpetuated forwards if they are not accounted for. So let's say, for argument's sake, I think that patients who have diabetes are likely to have worse outcomes than patients who don't have diabetes when it comes to looking after a cancer patient. And as a result of that, I give them atypical treatment. If I produce an algorithm that is to do with predicting someone's likelihood of living or dying from cancer, then it would identify that diabetes is associated with worse outcomes. I get a prediction that says that their survival is poor, and I then say I'm going to offer them atypical treatment. And so all I've done is I've created an algorithm that essentially provides me with confirmation bias that continues to perpetuate something that shouldn't be happening. And so we have to be mindful of the fact that anything that we build inherits the limitations of the data set on which it's built. The other thing that can make things more difficult is that identifying why a given answer or prediction or outcome from an algorithm has been identified or given can be very challenging. And people will often refer to machine learning as a black box. I personally don't particularly like this term. I actually don't think that it's true to say that you can't understand and interpret AI. I think, and particularly machine learning, there are methods that exist for it. They are often not as easy to interpret and can be difficult to get the exact information out you might want, but there are certainly methods available. But I think the point is it's much more difficult to do in an easily understandable way. And so when you combine the fact that it's difficult to find out why a prediction has been given, and also that there is the risk of bias, there's the risk that there's bias there that we can then struggle to identify. The last thing that I want to mention is the danger of using predictions to try and understand causality. And so if we go back to the example of the admission in oncology algorithm, and let's say we build our algorithm, it's worked really well, it's very tempting to say, look, we've got this algorithm that works really well. What we can do is we can look at the predictions and we can trace that back and we can try and identify which upfront characteristics are strongly determining the predictions. And let's say diabetes comes out as being really important. The temptation is to say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, diabetic patients are much more likely to come into hospital. So what we need to do is we need to intervene with these diabetic patients by tinkering with their diabetic medication, because perhaps that's going to reduce their likelihood of coming into hospital. And that seems very plausible. And I think that it's easy to fall into that trap. But if I use a different example, it becomes easy to understand why that's flawed. So there is a clinical finding that you will find in the literature called a diagonal earlobe crease. It's exactly as it says on the tin. It is a diagonal crease across someone's earlobe. And this shows you that that patient has a higher risk of cardiovascular events. Now, if I said to you the solution was for me to get a syringe of collagen filler and squirt it into that person's earlobe so that the crease disappears, and then I said to you, I have now reversed all of that negative cardiovascular risk, you would intuitively know that that's clearly not the case. But in fact, what I described before with looking backwards and identifying the predictors and intervening on those predictors is exactly the same thing. And the issue here is that models that are designed to try and work out cause and effect have to be very specifically designed and often are very bad predictions in terms of bad predictive models. Equally, models that are designed for prediction are optimized to try and use the minimum number of variables that give you the greatest level of predictive accuracy. And as a result, it tries to and will usually find variables that encode information about a whole host of different things. So that diagonal earlobe crease is telling you probably things about maybe lifestyle, maybe genetics, maybe things to do with how people developed in utero, a whole host of different things that may impact risk, but it's not really about the earlobe crease itself. In the same way, if you have diabetes, it may be that diabetes is telling you information about people's age. It might tell you things about whether or not they've got renal dysfunction or a whole host of other things. It is not necessarily that the diabetes is causing it. It is a marker for an at-risk group, but that doesn't mean that that's the optimal target intervention. And the risk is if we start to use predictive models in this way, we can start to introduce dangerous interventions that have no basis in scientific evidence that could have negative impact for patients. And so sorry, my slides are stuck. There we go. So the problems with these sorts of approaches have caused problems for a whole host of different companies when machine learning gets it wrong. And these are big companies, big names who have had problems with things that they've developed. So we'll start with Microsoft. So Microsoft develops something called Tay. Tay was a Twitter chatbot. And the idea behind it was that they wanted to develop something that would use everyday language and communicate with people over Twitter in the way that people talk on Twitter. Great idea. They trained it up front, they developed it, they deployed it, and the idea was that it continued to evolve based on the information and interactions that it was exposed to once it went live. And of course, the internet did what the internet does best, and it trolled Tay. So within a few hours, the unkind language that was being Tay was being exposed to altered the way that Tay started to interact with others, and it started to be a little bit unpleasant. It then was exposed to hate speech such that within a few hours, Tay became a fascist, bigoted neo-Nazi, and Microsoft had to take down the algorithm and deactivate it. And this is a really great example of if you provide biased data, you will get a biased algorithm. There is no ethical filter here, and so Tay was simply mirroring back what it had been exposed to. Google, another big company, they released an algorithm that was supposed to identify and automatically label images. And what you can see in the bottom center is that it gets the labels wrong. This was not only embarrassing for Google, highly offensive to a whole load of people, but is also a great example of where if you have underrepresentation of particular things, the algorithm is not going to do a good job of identifying that particular group. And so here, this was used on images from the internet, which have a massive bias towards people who are of Caucasian origin and ethnicity. And as a result of that, it was not very good at identifying people of lower socioeconomic group, people who were of different ethnicities. Now, this all sounds very kind of lighthearted, and these examples aren't really that important. But these same problems creep in when we start to apply machine learning in the healthcare setting. So this is pulled off the Stanford Machine Learning Group website. It was produced a number of years ago. It was a paper called ChexNet. And the idea was that they developed an algorithm that used the chest X-ray to identify whether or not somebody had evidence of a pneumonia or not. And they tested it, and they said that it was performing better than radiologists. And they released this paper with much fanfare. It got a lot of media coverage. It's still on their website as an excellent example of the sort of work that they can do. And there was a lot of kind of talk at the time about the fact that this sort of tool was wonderful for places that didn't necessarily have expert radiologists, and it could be used as an alternative. But there's a problem. And the problem is that the algorithm does not work in the way that you would hope. And the reason for this is because the data set on which it is trained has a problem. They used an open source data set, which is a series of chest X-rays and then a diagnostic label that is applied to it. And the diagnostic labels are wrong. And the reason that they're wrong is because instead of them being applied by having a clinician look at them and say, this is diagnosis, it was done by applying a language analysis algorithm to the X-rays reports. That then created what it felt was the appropriate diagnostic label. Those were in no way checked. The algorithm was then trained on this, and in a significant proportion of cases, the label is wrong. And so what this algorithm is actually doing is it's really, really accurate at systematically predicting the wrong answer because it has been trained using the wrong information. And so when it's then compared to a radiologist who gives the right answer, it is then essentially said, oh, the radiologist has got it wrong. But the algorithm has got it right, where in fact, actually, it's giving the wrong diagnosis. And the problem with this is that it got published, and the only time that these issues were picked up was when somebody who's an academic in Australia produced a blog about the data set and a blog about this particular journal publication. And it's a great example of where people can check something but not do it in a robust way, not necessarily involve people who have the domain expertise to see where the potential pitfalls are. And had this actually been deployed in the real world, would have created potentially dangerous decision-making that could have really harmed patients. And so there is a very real risk that if some of these potential gotcha type situations are not fully accounted for or looked into, that we can do real harm with these sorts of approaches. So now that we've got the doom and gloom bit out of the way, we can start to think about how we can use machine learning in healthcare. And the reality of it is there are almost boundless opportunities. So this previous publication broke down the kind of themes into research and development, clinical practice, population health, but anything where you've got data that relates in a strong way to a particular task or a piece of information, you can potentially use machine learning. So whether or not that's in drug discovery, whether or not it's trying to understand more about multi-omics or genomics data, whether or not it's trying to develop things that make a physician more efficient, whether or not it's better serving up of information in a timely manner. There's a whole host of different things that you can use it for. And really, if it's designed properly, if it's tested properly, then there's no reason why machine learning can't revolutionize and dramatically improve the way in which we practice medicine. And there's been a number of some really good projects that have got quite a lot of media attention, which employ machine learning methods. So there's a collaboration between DeepMind and Moorfield Eye Hospital, so where they used retinal images and they trained an algorithm to be able to identify 50 different pathologies from these retinal images. And they found that they were able to perform equivalent to world-leading experts on this particular topic. And this was a great example of using it in a very specific use case, having expertise from both clinicians and people who work in the machine learning field, working together to develop something, and has been very successful. There have been numerous attempts at using clinical images to detect melanoma. So these are some metrics that were pulled out of one particular publication in this area, where they found that the algorithm outperformed 58 dermatologists, although it has to be said that they didn't give a breakdown of how senior those dermatologists were. They found that overall it was providing better results than the dermatologists. But they were also very honest about the fact that it didn't work very well for atypical presentations of melanoma. And this comes back to the idea that if they don't have very many photographs of atypical presentations, or they don't have very many photographs of people who have more heavily pigmented skin, that it's not necessarily going to work as well in those groups. And it's important that they were very upfront about that. But you will find in a lot of circumstances that level of thought and that level of detail is simply not provided. So within Leeds, we have been involved in a whole range of different projects, but one project I'm involved in is looking at cardiac MRI. So cardiovascular disease is obviously a huge problem. There's a lot of it about, and one of the diagnostic tests that can be offered for patients is cardiac MRIs. The problem is that it's very technical skill to be able to interpret these. There aren't that many people who do. It's an expensive process to get them done. And as a result of this, the insufficient numbers of people who can interpret the report and provide reports on them, and in fact takes a long time, means that there's often long delays from when someone gets a scan to when they're reported. And so what we as a group looked at was, how do people go about doing these reports? And part of generating these reports is that people have to manually go in and delineate on the scans the anatomy of the heart to calculate a number of things. And if you can imagine, you've got a heart which is moving, and you've got slices going from top to bottom. So as a result of this, you've got everything from maximum contraction, maximum relaxation, and you've got a whole load of slices. And as a result of that, there's a huge number of images. And it's just simply too time consuming for somebody to manually go in and mark these up on all of those images. So typically what people do is they do maximum contraction, maximum relaxation. They do all of the different slices of the heart, of the images, and then they use that for developing their report and their metrics. And that usually takes people maybe 15 to 20 minutes in order to do. So we took data as a group that involved collected data that was collected as part of Biobank, and essentially tried to train an algorithm to do exactly the same thing. And what we were able to do is we were able to produce an algorithm that could do this automatic contouring of the structures of the heart, extract the metrics, and populate a report, but where instead of taking 20 minutes, it takes 1 minute. Now, the next step of this is not just simply saying, well, this works fabulously, now we're going to use it. The next step is to start to see how this works in the real world. And so the next step for us is looking at trying to deploy this in a hospital setting and do a head-to-head against clinicians and see how well this is actually working, but where clinicians are still reviewing the scans until we know that the technology is safe and appropriate to use. And part of the problem that we've had is that actually getting the AI solution, the machine learning solution, from the kind of research domain into clinical use is actually really difficult. And for the most part, we don't have infrastructure that is in place that enables that transition to happen easily. And so a lot of the things that you will see getting a lot of media coverage that happen in the academic world often don't port across into the real world of clinical practice. And so actually, despite huge advances, we don't necessarily see that on the front line. So it does beg the question, are we ready for AI in healthcare? And I think one of the problems is that, as I've already alluded to several times, to get good quality tools and solutions that work, the data that underpins them has to be good. And in a lot of hospitals, pooling information from lots of legacy systems, being able to get all the information in one place, tidying that up, understanding where that information has come from. Is it something that's been typed in by somebody and therefore might be error prone? Is it something that's come automatically as a feed from a laboratory machine that's doing a blood test? Understanding those sorts of things can often be really difficult, and getting access to that good quality data can be difficult. Even if you can access it, having ways of being able to extract it and put it into a usable format, making sure that there's information governance processes in place, being able to have even simple information about how many patients we've got, what types of patients we've got, often are not available. And so sometimes I think it's important that despite all of the promise and excitement around AI and machine learning, that often these basic things about getting your data sorted first is actually far more important and will yield far more impact than simply trying to jump in with fancy methods. And often you're better off focusing on getting just basic intelligence out of that data rather than trying to jump in with artificial intelligence. So for example, one of the things that we've done locally is that we've taken the data that every hospital is collecting as part of the National Cancer Registry and built an interactive cancer analytics dashboard. This could be run on any hospital across the country and essentially allows clinicians to look at survival outcomes, numbers of patients, whether or not particular groups may have worse outcomes, look at geospatial information, look at differences and referral patterns across the region, be able to look at things like 2-week wait data. And this is all data that is sat there that is being curated anyway to be submitted as part of the National Cancer Registry, but that people haven't got access to, and that the data that they often have access to is 2 or more years out of date by the time it's released by Public Health England. And so this is offering people a way of being able to get information, get insight, but without any need for any machine learning, nothing like that. But this is still incredibly useful. And so one of the things that I think is important is to say, actually, do I need the artificial intelligence, or do I need to start actually doing other things that are easier, less complicated, less error prone, and we can do straight away? So one of the things that I've heard come up an awful lot at a number of faculty events is, how can I decide if we should be buying or commissioning a tool? How can I assess whether or not a tool is good? And this seems to be a position that increasingly healthcare workers are put in, this position to make that sort of decision. And I have a real problem with this as a question, not because there's an issue with asking it, but because I don't think people should be put in that position in the first place. And I'm going to give an example here. So this is to do with a paper that was produced out of China, where they were looking at functional MRIs and patients with brain injury. And the idea was, could they create an algorithm that would look at functional MRIs and predict whether or not this patient was going to wake up within the 12 months after they had gone into their coma? It was run against the predictions of clinicians, and it was shown to be better than clinicians at predicting the likelihood of someone waking up. And they quoted this 90% accuracy. And the problem with this is that I am not an expert in brain injury, and I have no way of knowing whether or not actually the likelihood of somebody in this situation waking up from this sort of terrible head injury is pretty low. And if we, for example, assumed that the likelihood of someone waking up was only 1 in 10, then if the algorithm simply just said no for everybody, no, they're not going to wake up, it will still have a 90% accuracy. It's actually not using any information, it's not functioning in the way that we want it to, but it still looks as though it's performing really well. And so the problem is that even as somebody who has a degree of expertise in machine learning and understanding of how you can test algorithms, without the domain expertise, it's impossible for me to know whether or not this is really a good algorithm or not. Equally, if someone has the domain expertise, but in regards to traumatic brain injury, but they don't have the expertise in terms of the AI and machine learning, then it becomes very difficult for them to assess whether or not this is any good. And if we were thinking about this not in terms of machine learning solutions, but in terms of drugs, then there is no way that I, as a clinician, would be asked to make a decision as to whether or not a drug should be licensed. There are organizations that do this as their role, who have expertise in doing these kinds of assessments. They get people who have the domain expertise in the clinical area. They have the domain expertise in knowing about clinical trials and evidence. They will be looking at cost effectiveness. And so as a result of that, I might decide whether or not something is clinically appropriate for me to prescribe. I might look at a publication and look at see whether or not I think that there's enough information in a publication that might alter the way that I have my prescribing practice. But ultimately, I don't have to decide whether or not something gets licensed. And that's because I'm expected to be trial literate rather than a trial expert. I don't need to know how to do a full cost effectiveness analysis, because NICE do that. I don't need to be able to know how to start and run end-to-end a clinical trial. That's not necessary. And the problem is that we've ended up in a situation where the pace of technological development has vastly outstripped the infrastructure that sits around it. And as a result of that, clinicians and healthcare workers are being asked to make the sorts of decisions that are in many ways very similar to, should a drug be licensed? should we be using this AI technology in my hospital? And what I would say to people is, if you think of it in those terms, is a one-day training session on this going to be enough? Is a one-week training session going to be enough? Is a one-month training session going to be enough? How much expertise do you feel is appropriate before you should be making that sort of decision? And I think that that's something that we're all going to have to increasingly grapple with, or we need to be starting to look at what processes and what organizations sit around AI and machine learning, and how those can better support the commissioning, development, and purchase of these sorts of tools. Because, as I hope I've demonstrated, there are a very large number of ways that this sort of technology can make mistakes with even people who have expertise in the area, and the best of intentions, stuff can go wrong. And I think that hand in hand with this, we have constantly been fed the concept, often in the media, driven by industry, that machine learning is quick, it's easy, it's cheap, and we can develop tools that we can get into the hands of patients very easily. And I think that actually, in many ways, that isn't the case at all. And getting this right, safely testing to make sure that it's behaving in the way that you expect, is probably going to need many steps, testing in many places, and not just looking at historic data and how well a tool works on that historic data, but doing something very similar to a clinical trial where prospectively you test it and you see where the failings are and you see how it can fall down. And as it stands at the moment, the money is often not available for this sort of thing, and the willingness for people to do that is often not available. But I would personally argue that I think that that is the safe way to try and mitigate for some of these many gotcha type situations that you can run into. So I hope that that has been a kind of informative whistle-stop tour through a number of things. I would encourage people to follow the faculty on social media. They are on Twitter, LinkedIn. There's the discourse where people can chat and find out more. And I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. So yeah, thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Kieran. That's really excellent. I'm afraid we've only got 10 minutes left for questions, so it's probably best just to start with the ones that are already on the chat there. And the first question was from Elena Kariki, saying, surely I've got this wrong. Machine learning is something supposed to involve human experts training the models, rather than your example of natural language understanding used to interpret the radiology reports as a gold standard.
Well, so it's not about what's the gold standard, it's about where you start with the data set. So if the task is saying, how do I predict what the diagnosis is, you start with a data set. And if that data set is just a series of chest x-rays and labels, you could develop your algorithm based on that. Now, if you don't look into where those labels came from and where there might be errors in that underlying data set, then you inherit those errors when you develop your tool off the back of that information.
Right.
So in an ideal world, you shouldn't really stack models. So because models will inherit the bias, if you have a machine learning model that, say, extracts the diagnosis and that has an error rate, and then you train an additional model on that information and it has an error rate, then it means that you have the kind of compounding of those two sets of errors. And so as a result, it will perform even worse. But I think a common problem is that people will use an open source data set because it's really difficult to get access to good quality healthcare data.
Yep.
And as a result of that, people just use what's available, and the information about it either isn't looked into or simply isn't available for people to look into. And so you don't know where the potential pitfalls are.
It's what I would call a data set driven project rather than a clinical problem driven project. And essentially what we're dealing here with is a very tarnished gold standard, reference standard. In fact, it's not really reference standard at all. Yeah. The next question was about somebody who's already got some experience in machine learning and informatics, but wants to progress their career. It's Mark Bailey. And I wonder whether you can communicate with him offline, but essentially, how would you recommend progressing your career in clinical informatics? I think the short answer is join the early careers special interest group of the FCI. Join the FCI, certainly. It's open to clinicians of all professions.
The other thing I would also add into that is that you will be amazed at how much of a positive response you will get by simply asking people if there's something that you can do. And so find out locally whether or not anyone's doing stuff in health informatics and ask whether or not you can get involved in these sorts of projects. I personally think that hands-on programming and development is something that anyone can learn to do. It's just a case of being able to find the time to invest in learning how to do it. And I think if you're willing to do it, anyone can do it.
And Dr. Ramalingan says, I need that cancer dashboard in my clinical service in London. Please advise how we can obtain this.
Well, if you contact me offline, I'm very happy to discuss how we might be able to start getting this up and running elsewhere. We're in the process of trying to roll it out across the whole of Yorkshire and Humber, but the idea is to get as many places using it as possible. It's completely open source, so just get in touch with me and we'll see what we can work out.
Kieran, maybe you could put your contact details, preferred contact details in the chat.
Yes.
The next comment, Kirsten Lord is saying, fabulous presentation. How far away are we from allowing AI to make decisions autonomously without human intervention? Or do you think that's unlikely?
I think it depends on what the task is in many ways. And I think that sometimes by altering the question that you are asking, the likelihood of something being safe is changed. So if we take the melanoma example and we say that we're trying to identify the patients that have cancer, that can be potentially challenging and the risk is that you miss patients. Sometimes it's easier to say I can identify the patients who definitely don't have cancer and those can then be filtered out and go into a standard pathway, and that might be a more appropriate approach. I personally am much more comfortable with the idea of what some people would refer to as augmented intelligence, which is about how we can use information to better inform clinician decision making, but where, as it stands at the moment, it's exactly that. It's informing clinical decision making. It is not doing it in and of itself. Whether or not there are certain applications where it could be done completely autonomously and safely, I think that there probably are some, but I think the level of checking that would be needed in order to be happy that that's working safely would need to be fairly significant.
My answer to that would be that there are already closed loop systems. Whether you call them AI or not is perhaps semantics. They certainly use an algorithm, a carefully designed, tested and implemented algorithm. For example, in closed loop control of blood, unstable diabetes and unstable hypertension. And obviously those systems get validated at the highest level by the MHRA and similar organizations. Another question is, how do we ensure, this is from Sebastian Alexander, how do we ensure the new AI is clinically safe? How the safety standards are applied and who gives that assurance?
Well, this is something that is a rapidly evolving area, and it's only a few years since NICE introduced updated rules around what sorts of levels of evidence would be required for kind of digital health solutions and whether or not those directly impacted, care and decision making. They require different levels of evidence. I think the problem is that this is still not an area that has been fleshed out fully. And in my view, there should be an equivalent to going through multiple phases of clinical studies for testing AI. And
we're working on that at the AI lab. I'm working with the NHS AI lab to fill the gap between regulation and clinical trials, because if you're introducing a lab test, you don't insist on having a clinical trial of the lab test. What you do need to do, though, is to make sure that you understand its accuracy, sensitivity, specificity, etc., in all likely clinical scenarios. And that's what we're doing with the AI lab at the moment. So just to quickly answer that. There's a comment about the RSM conference on AI and healthcare. I think the link is actually to a kind of tutorial that I could find rather than what I would call a conference. Other compliments, Ben Wright says, great, thank you. We've got 3 minutes left. And so does Tom Nichols. Do you know what's happening about the implementation of the EU directive on software medical devices with Brexit? Has it been scrapped? I can answer that because I work with the MHRA as well. The answer is that that still is in force until 2023, mid-2023. And MHRA is busy developing some new regulations based on those EU medical devices regulations, and I think basically watch this space. But for the moment, the current EU regulations apply for the next 2 and a bit years. Another question, great presentation, thank you, from Rebecca Randall. A question at the bottom, Julie, you've really given us the confidence after to speak out what I felt strongly to be true about the myths of AI will stick to one of the main tasks, facilitating good data, says Julie. And there's a couple of emails. Thanks, great talk. I have to drop. So any other questions there? I can't see any hands raised. There's a Tom Nichols is giving you a big thumbs up. I had a comment about generalization. I mean, a lot of AI machine learning scientists claim that deep learning allows you to generalize from data, and that therefore the system can begin to produce predictions on cases that it has never actually encountered before. What's your thoughts about that, Kieran?
So I think that there's the issue of generalization, and then there's the issue of how representative something is. And those are subtly different. And so if you have something that is actually really good in the types of people that you have trained it in, it may generalize well in those populations. But if there is something fundamental about the population that you've developed this on, which is different from the population that you then plan to implement it on, and those people clinically have different outcomes, then I think that it is unlikely to perform well in those people. So it is the difference within the same types of people. Yes, it may well generalize different settings. It may work really well. But if you fail to capture certain groups, it can't work out. It can't apply patterns it doesn't know exist. And so I think that that's a subtle distinction that people sometimes miss.
Sure. So, for example, you might develop an AI trained on many thousands of patients with type 2 diabetes, and it could safely generalize and give you useful results on a new patient with type 2 diabetes with a combination of clinical findings that were not in the original training data set. However, it'd be unwise to use that on people with type 1 diabetes.
Precisely. And it comes back to that same idea of, actually, when you boil it down to it, that's a slightly different task, and that's not the task for which it's been trained.
Absolutely. And Tom Nichols says, could you please share your presentation with us? I don't know whether you're going to make it available on the FCI website as PDF, for example.
Yeah, I'm happy to make it available as a PDF, no problem.
And in fact, Tom says, please could, I guess since you've given your email address, he can write to you separately.
Yes.
Lots of other comments and compliments. I think we're getting to the end. I just wanted to say a couple of words at the end. Kieran, I think many thanks indeed for really entertaining and deceptively simple introduction. I think you've covered a lot of the complexities of AI, in fact, in your talk. And we're very keen to arrange more similar webinars to this in the AI Special Interest Group. And we are keen to hear from you, the people who are participating, about topics you'd like to hear about and or speakers you'd like to hear from. And you are allowed to propose yourself, although you might need to send us a brief explanation about why you think you can give a webinar in this series. The other thing is that we are working currently on some exciting new development with the AI lab and the FCI. It's not decided yet exactly what form that might take, but watch this space for some news about how the FCI may be able to help support the work of the NHSX AI lab in future. And finally, there is actually a job advert that was posted here with a link, and it's actually a clinical fellowship funded between HE, the Health Education England, and the AI lab, and it's out for advert right now, and there's a link there in the chat. So I think we're probably going to have to draw it to a close. Again, many more comments. Thanks again to Kieran for presenting this evening, and to all of you for participating, for your interesting and challenging questions. There's a note from Joe Jubb. Please contact him if you're interested in presenting a webinar or have suggestions for future topics. So we'll have a virtual round of applause for Kieran, and thanks everybody for turning up this evening. Bye then.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thanks, Kieran. Thanks,
Bye
Kieran.
then.
Thank you.